Alright, good morning ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're into part 3 of our exploration of the plant kingdom. Today we're going to be looking all at something called bryophytes, which are, I have a couple categories here, but basically these are our mosses, our liverworts, our hornworts, anything that kind of grows attached to a tree or in very wet, damp environments. Before I jump into here, I'm just going to do a quick recap. So in the past videos we talked about features of plants. So these are things like eukaryotic, multicellular for the most part, autotrophic again for the most part. The other big thing was that we talked about sporophyte and gametophyte were the two life cycles that all plants go through. So they had this sort of dual life cycle going on. So the way to think about it is sporophytes were always diploid. They had two sets of each chromosome, or we said 2N, and the gametophytes were haploid, and they were 1N. And the previous thing that we've talked about was algae, which we said was gametophyte dominant. So I'll be making a lot of comparisons for bryophytes to algae because they're sort of the next step in plant evolution. But at this stage, spending most of their lifespan in this gametophyte stage. One thing I did forget to mention that I'll go back to. So when I was talking about this in the past video, about how this type of algae kind of reproduces asexually if the conditions are good, and if conditions are bad, it goes into some sort of fertilized shell, or it fertilizes and then it splits into 4 mature versions. This part, the reason why it's sort of like why they use it if conditions are bad is that this produces a shell. I'll say shell with quotes around it, but basically it can kind of wait it out. It's sort of like an egg or a seed in the way that it can wait for better conditions. So it can spend a good chunk of its time there, but when conditions are favorable, most of the time the algae will be in this sort of active asexual reproduction stage. Okay, going back. So here's a couple of examples of different bryophytes. Mosses, hornworts, liverworts. These are actually all different phyla. So even though we categorize them as bryophytes, they are actually belonging to their own phyla or phylum. So, a couple of features. So, mosses, we'll generally just talk about mosses. They belong to a group of plants called bryophytes. They have specialized reproductive organs enclosed by other reproductive cells. So, this is both in the sporophyte and the gametophyte stage, which means that in each part of its life, it has sexual reproductive cells and specialized reproductive organs. This was unlike in algae, where they just tend to fuse, fertilize, and then they would divide. Bryophytes show a higher degree of cell specialization than green algae and were in fact one of the first plants on land. So this means that they have adaptations to use less water. Now, when I say less water, I mean less than algae. Generally speaking, we won't find bryophytes living in the desert because they still need a very wet environment. And this is sort of where we can see that transitional stage where they still require a lot of water, but they can survive with less than the previous most common ancestor or relative. So there's 3 groups of bryophytes that I've talked about already: mosses, hornworts, and liverworts, and we generally consider them in separate phyla. So one of the things that might stand out to you is bryophytes. All the ones that I've shown here are very small plants. So why are bryophytes small? They always lack this vascular tissue. So this is a specialized tissue containing hardened lignin tubes that carry water throughout a plant. You'll also hear in future they're called xylem tubes. These are responsible for carrying water, say, throughout a tree. And in fact, because bryophytes don't have this specialized tissue, they can't draw water up past a meter off the ground due to gravity. Gravity is actually too strong. If you were to imagine trying to suck water through a meter-long straw, you could do it. It would be very challenging, but you also have things like lungs, a diaphragm. You can create that pressure difference. Bryophytes don't have any means of doing that, so they have to be relatively small, because if they were any taller, they wouldn't be able to pull water up along them, and as a result, they are very limited in how large they can grow, unlike other types of plants like trees that can grow several meters in height. So, life cycle, like all plants, bryophytes display this alternation of generations, so this haploid to diploid, and like algae, they're dominant in the gametophyte stage. Don't worry about seeing the figure, I'll show that to you. But because it's gametophyte dominant, the gametophyte is the stage that carries out the majority of photosynthesis. So when we look at mosses, generally the green parts that we can see, or when we look at moss, most of that would be the gametophyte. The sporophyte is actually entirely dependent on the gametophyte for its supply of water and nutrients. The bryophytes produce sperm cells, which need to swim in order to find an egg to fertilize. Therefore, they need to be in an area with sufficient water. So they need damp environments, because the sperm will actually swim to a female moss or gametophyte in order to fertilize. So generally speaking, they need to be in an area that has some standing water for at least part of the year. And that's when they would reproduce. So the gametophyte, it produces gametes through the reproductive structures. At the tips of those gametophytes, eggs are produced in something called the archegonia. The sperm are produced in the antherida, and the sperm and egg cells fuse together, similar to how it happens in humans through fertilization, to create a diploid 2N zygote. So then, this zygote forms into the sporophyte, and it is actually attached to the gametophyte. So it first becomes a multicellular embryo within the gametophyte that will eventually grow out of the body of the gametophyte and develop a long stalk with a capsule in the end called the sporangium. This is what produces the spores. I have a picture to show you, so I actually have two pictures. So the main structure of moss, you have the gametophyte is this main part that we see. This is where we get photosynthesis. The rhizoid would be the roots. So water, nutrients, and I'll say anchoring, so they can attach themselves to different structures like the ground or soil or trees. Main part of photosynthesis happens with the gametophyte, and then out of the gametophyte, starting here and growing up, this is the sporophyte. So if you were to think about this plant, it would have one set of chromosomes for all of its cells in this region, and then it'd be 2N for all the cells in this region. And most of the time, the moss will just be this portion. We won't see the top part, but once it becomes fertilized during that period of standing water, then the sporophyte can grow out of it. So how it sort of happens, or how its life cycle looks, I'm going to start right here. So we have a brand new spore. We'll get to where these come from at the end, but you can already see in this picture. What'll happen is, through mitosis, they'll reproduce and produce different gametophytes. This is how they would appear on different areas. So each one of these produces an individual plant. If we follow the rightmost path, it'll grow into a female gametophyte. Looks slightly different than the male one, but in both cases, they form this sort of rhizoid and the gametophyte. So each spore will become its own organism if the conditions allow it to survive. Then, in the portion of each of these, you're going to get here's the archegonium, and the egg forms inside, and then the antheridium. So this one would be male. It produces sperm cells, so then they would swim into the archegonia and find the egg. So in this whole stage right here, we were saying it's haploid. So sperm reach the egg, fertilization happens, so then this part right here is the diploid zygote. It forms into the embryo, and then from the embryo we get this sporophyte growing. At the tip we have this sort of capsule or bulb, so the spores are produced inside this, and then once they're fully developed, they're released and they start the process all over again. Now, again, with this halfway split, it's saying that this is the diploid side, but remember, all of this part here and the green bit here and the green bit here is all haploid. It is still partially a haploid creature, partially a diploid creature, and it has just different life cycles. Also, as a kind of a direct result of this, the sporophytes will only grow out of female gametophytes because it requires the fusion of sperm and egg cells, and the sperm are the ones that find the eggs. So if you find a plant, or if you find a moss or a liverwort or a hornwort that looks like this, then it is female, because it has to be. So one of the fun things you can do while looking around at certain parts of the year, you'll see this structure growing out of moss if you look carefully, and you can determine which mosses are female and which ones are male. So kind of a fun thing that you could maybe take a look at. In any case, I'm gonna keep this part to just this, or keep this lesson to just this part. So in a bit we're going to be getting to ferns and things like trees and flowering plants. But for now, I'll leave it here. As always, take care, stay safe, have a good one.